When Todd looked at the old man's house, he saw nothing out of the ordinary. The lawn was thin in areas and patched with dandelions and yellow spots, but so were dozens of other lawns in the community. There was an old Ford pickup parked in front of the house, back bumper dented, blue paint peeling off along the sides of the doors. This was nothing new. He'd seen several trucks like this throughout the week. There was a slightly tilted swing on the porch, and a screen door hung open, swaying lightly in the breeze. The entire house was white with a steeple point at the top of the roof. Thomas and Jake gazed at the old man's house with a combination of mischievous humor and unsettled reluctance. The two boys had lived in Chester, Utah all their lives. They had heard all the myths and legends surrounding David Pritched, known to all as Old Man Pritched. Todd often heard stories about the old man, because everyone in town had a story to tell. Thomas and Jake had told him a fair amount of stories during their daily walks to the local grocery store for candy bars and soda. One in particular, which caused Thomas to laugh so hard that soda burst out his nose, told of a time when Pritchett got pulled over by Sheriff Barry out on the entrance of town in front of Cole's gas station. Pritchett had a combination of alcohol and a bad mood in his system, some claiming a woman up in Ferguson stood him up. Such a heady combination caused Pritchett to hammer the gas pedal to the floor just as old Sheriff Barry was getting out of his patrol car. The sheriff ended up chasing him for half an hour throughout town. Lots of townsfolk watched it out the front window. Eventually Pritchett tried to leave town and drove off the side of the road to get stuck in a gravel pit. That's when Sheriff Barry got the chance to arrest him. Pritchett shouted incoherencies and vulgarities during the whole process. Depending on who told the story, one might get an ending with a fistfight or a gun standoff. Jake claimed that his neighbor, Mr. Stevens, had a problem with Pritchett sneaking over to his house late at night to spy on his daughters. When his daughter Stephanie claimed she saw a shadowy face peeking through her window, Mr. Stevens decided that was enough proof for him to be convinced. Some in town claimed the man hid illegal drugs in his basement. Some said he was a Satan worshiper or a child molester. The rumors spread far and wide, and Thomas and Jake's curiosity had finally reached the brim. They were tired of just hearing stories that brought no satisfaction, only more questions that intensified their curiosity. That late afternoon, as they sat on the park grass across the street from Pritchett's house, they devised a plan to discover the man's secrets. They called this plan Operation Truth. "The people need to know," Jake said, speaking in a whisper, as if the old man could hear them from 50 yards away inside his house. Of course, Todd knew there was more to it than that. Jake's imagination was probably in full force, partly pretending he was some kind of special forces guy or a super spy. At age 14, one's imagination was just beginning to divide the yoke between childhood fancies and the duller realities of growing up. This man seems to be trouble, and good townsfolk here in Chester deserve to know the bad things going on under their noses. Now he sounded like a Clint Eastwood-style detective, nibbling at a cigar with his eyes squinted in harsh determination. Thomas, a short pudgy kid with messy dark hair who always wore tank tops because he believed he had muscles to sport, although he mostly had baby fat, nodded at every sentence Jake spoke. Jake could say, "We're all a bunch of jackasses walking off the edge of a cliff to fall in a fiery pit below," and Thomas would be nodding with a toothy big-ass grin on his face. Thomas was like Jake's happy-go-lucky dog, ready to play fetch at every moment. "You sure this is our business?" Todd chimed in. He was willing to give his opinion, although he knew it was rarely respected by these two. Both Thomas and Jake narrowed their eyes at him. Todd saw so much of Jake's dad in Jake. Their hair was the same brown, tousled mop. They both eyed everything with aggravated suspicion. Everything around them, everything and everyone, was hiding some kind of sinister intention. Jake's dad was a mechanic at the shop on Main Street. Every smoke break the guy rambled on about the government, the state, religion, his neighbor. On and on he talked about the sinister intentions of all these things. The world was against everyone. Even when some of it was true, you still couldn't help but feel annoyed. Todd felt annoyed right then. He kind of wanted to smack Jake upside the head. "Well, Then you can just sit on the sideline and cheer for us, cheerleader, Jake said. Todd smirked at that one. Had he not been so annoyed, he probably would have burst out laughing. Was he suddenly in a teen movie now, and Jake was the big bad bully hazing him? Jake carried on explaining his plan, eyes narrowed in that do you feel lucky punk manner. I've seen the old man leave to either take a walk or drive somewhere every night around 9 o'clock. When he leaves, that's when we sneak into the house. One of us will stand guard outside. We'll use the walkies to communicate when he's coming. Todd saw a flaw in the plan already. Once the person standing guard saw Mr. Pritched returning, Pritched would see the intruder exiting the door as he got out of the car, unless they went out the back door. Yet if Pritched decided to wander back there, he'd probably catch them. A flaw that big and a plan this stupid was the straw that broke the camel's back. I'm out, Todd said. Thomas and Jake glowered at him. Jake's was sincere. Thomas's was imitation. You guys are just going to fall into some kind of trouble. I'm out. Todd walked away and didn't look back. Pussy, Jake yelled, and that was that. The sound of knocking on the bedroom door awoke Todd the next morning. Come in, Todd said. His father entered the room, a tall man with his son's wide ears, square jaw, and green eyes, although his hair was brown instead of blonde. His father looked like he was standing before a funeral procession by how tense his face looked with his hands folded before his belly. Todd's stomach clenched. I've got some unfortunate news, his father said in a quiet voice, seeming to wince as he spoke. Your friends Jake and Thomas have gone missing. A police search is ongoing. Sheriff Barry is here. He wants to ask you some questions about when you saw them last. They're not my friends. The thought flashed in his mind when his father began to speak. After he processed the whole message, the guilt sank in. He supposed they were friends in a sense, considering how often he spent time with them. Sheriff Barry was sitting on the blue living room couch, notepad in hand, tapping a pencil on the pad. He was dressed in his full uniform, gun holstered at the side, badge shining over his left breast. Todd felt cold dread fill him. There was a chair positioned in front of the sheriff, obviously put there by Todd's father. Hi, Todd, the sheriff said as Todd came in and sat down. Hello, Todd said. So last night around 11 we got a report from both Thomas's and Jake's parents that their sons did not come home. I was informed that you had been spending time with them. I left that afternoon. The interruption had been accidental. Todd honestly thought the sheriff was finished talking. So you have no idea where they might have gone? Todd thought about it and realized he really didn't have any idea. He stated his last known facts. Last I was with them, we were standing in the park across the street from Mr. Pritchard's house. They both wanted to sneak into the old man's house and find out if he was hiding anything in there. Sheriff Barry brushed his fingers through a thick gray mustache and leaned forward. Do you mean find out what he had inside his house? Yeah, Todd nodded. They thought he might be hiding something in the basement. The sheriff jotted down some notes. Usual child mischief, he mumbled. Then he looked at Todd, brow creased with concern. Good thing for you didn't get caught up in that mischief. The sheriff then got up and made his way to the door, thanking both Todd and his father for their time. Todd's father opened the door, and the sheriff turned to them and said a few more things. I will talk to Mr. Pritched. Hopefully we can find some details from him. We're in the process of organizing a massive search as well. He stepped outside and Todd's father closed the door. Rumors spread quickly about the disappearance of the two boys over the next few days. Some claimed the boys had struggled with addiction and depression and finally gave in and killed themselves. Some claimed they went wandering in the hills and got lost or fell down and broke some bones and couldn't get back. Some held on to hope that the boys would be found. The sheriff interrogated David Pritched, but didn't find any evidence that the old man had any interaction with the two boys. Law enforcement didn't investigate any further. However, Sheriff Barry had to put his foot down one night when friends and relatives of Jake and Thomas showed up at Mr. Pritchard's door yelling at him and demanding that he reveal the truth. At one point, Thomas's father even showed up with a gun, and the sheriff almost had to detain him. Other kids egged the old man's house. Some even went as far as accusing Todd of being a part of it, suggesting that he helped old man Pritchett hide the bodies. Searches continued for weeks. No sign of them was found. Todd still figured he knew the boys' whereabouts. He felt sure old man Pritched caught them sneaking into his house that night and probably killed them out of anger for messing into his life. Then the old man dismembered their bodies and disposed of them somewhere, maybe way out in the hills. Todd had seen plenty of those murder mysteries when such things happened all the time. Nightmares began to torment Todd's sleep. The worst of them depicted Todd standing on the lawn of Mr. Pritchard's house. Muffled screams erupted from inside the house. Then pounding began to happen. The basement windows shook in their frames. The front door banged open, and Mr. Pritchard came hobbling down the sidewalk toward him. Todd froze at the sight of Mr. Pritchard. Some unseen force held him in place. The old man's skin began to change, becoming gray and translucent. Certain places in his skin began to bulge, growing and growing until they eventually popped, splattering pus all over him. Serpent-like creatures fell out of his skin, squirming on the grass, slithering towards Todd. The dream didn't feel like any normal dream. It gave him a strange feeling he'd never felt before. The dream was more vivid than usual dreams, and he knew he had to perform a special Operation Truth of his own. For the next few days, while many others continued to search throughout the town and mountains, Todd staked out Mr. Pritchard's house. He watched the old man's habits, when the old man would leave and return. Jake had been right. Pritchard always left his house at 9 o'clock at night. Sometimes he drove off somewhere. Sometimes he simply went on a walk. Either way, he always left at 9 o'clock sharp. According to Todd's dream, the trauma seemed to come from the basement. That was the place where he planned to infiltrate. One Friday night, Todd decided to follow through with his plan. He arrived at the park across from Mr. Pritchard's house and waited and watched. Just as usual, Mr. Pritchard left the house at 9, his slouched figure hobbling toward his truck. Todd immediately went into action once he saw the old man drive away. A small thrill ignited within him as he did, sparking his imagination. It kind of felt like a special forces soldier, infiltrating an enemy base, or maybe he was a super spy. He realized that this must have been the thrill for Thomas and especially Jake. Living in a small town like this with little to nothing to do, sometimes imagining yourself to be something far more was the only thrill one could get. Arriving at the front door, Todd tripped on the front step. He almost fell into the screen door but managed to maintain his balance. Not a good start. That felt a little bit like a bad omen. Now came the vital moment. Would the door be locked or unlocked? Todd took the brass knob in his hand. It felt very cold, colder than it should have felt in the warm summer night. He turned the knob and heard the latch disengage. The hinges squeaked as he pushed the door open. It was dark inside the house. Todd decided not to turn on any lights. He might forget to turn one off when he left, leaving evidence that he had been there. Instead, he switched on his cell phone light and gradually navigated himself throughout the house. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it pulse down his arm and to his wrist. In the entry was a coat rack, at the moment showing empty pegs. Todd turned the corner to illuminate an old refrigerator with scuff marks all over the door. There was a fake plant sitting atop the fridge. Green leaves snaked down over the top edge. A mini TV sat in a corner nook in the kitchen. Todd could imagine the old man watching football while he cooked breakfast Sunday morning. The living room had a coffee table with astronomy, Sports Illustrated, and aviation magazines scattered over it. There was a bookshelf against one wall filled with encyclopedias. Various books on philosophy and history filled the bottom shelf. Todd wondered if the old man actually read them, or if he just had them there to look good. A painting of a large city hung on the wall over the couch. 2 bedrooms contained nothing out of the ordinary. Beds, nightstands, lamps, a closet to hang clothing. Todd took all of this in and decided the old man lived in a pretty normal house. I'm the strange new addition, he thought, and this thought almost made him burst out in crazy laughter. The basement door was located right at the end of the hall near the bedrooms. It felt sinister seeing that dark wooden door at the far end of the shadowy hallway. He felt different seeing that door, as if something cold and menacing had slipped under his skin. As Todd walked up to the door, that feeling intensified, almost pushing him away, like a force field surrounding the area. He grasped the brass knob and realized this was the point of no return. The screaming and pounding in his dream had emphasized that. The door opened without one squeak in the hinges. There was something more disturbing about the quiet than the squeaking. Todd expected squeaking. The basement steps were made of cement and warped and cracked in places. His footsteps lightly echoed with each step he took down into the basement. His imagination did its worst as he made his way down the steps. Would he find his friends dead and cut up in pieces like something out of a Chainsaw Massacre movie? Each echoing step emphasized this fantasy. Along with each thud of his heart, sweat formed on his palms and his forehead. What else might he find? Another image flashed in Todd's mind of boxes full of drugs. He wasn't sure what these drugs would look like, but he imagined something like he often saw in movies, a powder wrapped up in paper, or perhaps the table would be cluttered with vials full of bubbling liquid. When he reached the bottom, he saw a blank wall. Large nails protruded from the cement. Todd turned the corner, expecting to see the horrors he imagined. All he saw was rows full of jars full of peaches and beans. He examined the ground along the bottom of the shelves, hoping to find an article of clothing or some kind of hint of his friend's existence in the house. Nothing. All he saw was a couple of spiders scurrying along. He stepped on one of them. Okay, so nothing, but this doesn't mean the guy's not a murderer. Maybe he disposed of the bodies elsewhere, buried them out in the woods. A chill rushed through Todd at the thought of that, making him shiver. He could imagine lumps of dirt out in the desert, their bodies chopped up in pieces underneath those piles of dirt, maggots and worms wriggling between rotting flesh. Time to leave. He was just about to turn around and do just that when he heard the basement door snap shut upstairs. The sound of it made him jump and gasp. He listened closely and heard footsteps thudding around upstairs. The old man had arrived home. Usually, when Todd watched him leave, the old man was gone nearly a couple hours. According to his cell phone, Mr. Pritched decided to come back early. It was only 9:45. Todd stood frozen next to the shelf of peaches. He heard footsteps wandering about up there. He also heard the muffled sound of voices, and soon he realized it was the TV. The old man might have turned on the nightly news. Ideas, horrible ideas, began to clutter and race through his mind in that moment. It reminded him of seeing a swarm of ants in a bottle, all of them clambering over each other in a panic. His thoughts were like those ants, racing all over each other and soon to die. He looked in the jars along the shelves with his cell phone light. A couple times he came across a jar that had mold growing in it. At first he thought it might be something worse, perhaps a moldering severed ear or a dislodged eyeball. He had to stifle his screams in those moments, so the old man wouldn't hear him. Once I hear the TV go off and signs of him going to bed, then I'll head up there to leave. Plain and simple, he thought. He felt a sense of determination at the thought. Not all hope was lost, at least not for him. He checked his cell phone battery. The bar was now yellow, power save mode, and had 15% life. Not a lot, but plenty to last throughout this occasion. He continued to pace back and forth. 30 minutes later, Todd received a phone call from his mother. He chose not to answer, and she left a voicemail asking where he was. Todd considered texting her a lie that he was with such and such friend, but decided against it when he realized she might go over to that friend's house. Just wait it out, Todd thought. Sooner or later this guy will go to bed and you can wander out of here. Finally, after an hour and 20 minutes, the TV turned off. Todd heard the old man's footsteps move about upstairs along with the clattering of dishes and running water. Then silence. Todd waited for a full minute, just to be sure. His phone began to vibrate, another call from his mother. He whispered, "Oh, please, please," to himself as he declined the call. After a minute passed without any more sounds from upstairs, Todd made his move. He forced himself not to run, but continued to sneak along up the cement steps. When he made it to the basement door, a horrible thought came to him. What if it's locked? He clenched his teeth, holding back the scream of both frustration and terror. Images of the old man coming down to him later, perhaps with a loaded gun or a knife, paraded through his mind. He grasped the cold brass handle and turned it, praying that it would turn all the way. The knob turned, and the latch snapped out of place. Todd pushed the door open, close to hyperventilating at this point. Tears began to stream down his cheeks as he closed the door behind him. It's like a dream, he thought. Soon I won't be able to move. Soon the hallway will stretch longer and longer. Todd whimpered as he maneuvered through the hall to the front door. The whimpering turned to screaming as he was sure he heard rustling behind him as he made it through the kitchen. There was the front door, a wall of darkness in the night. One last obstacle before he was free. As he grasped the knob and nearly ripped the door off the hinges, he screamed again, for he was sure he could feel the old man's hands on his neck, hard and prickly. He burst into the night once he had opened both the main door and the screen door, and he did not concern himself as to whether the doors were closed behind him. Once he was a good 3 blocks distance from the old man's house, Todd stopped running and slowed himself to a walking pace. However, he kept it a fast walk. His own house was a block away. Soon he would be safe. He wasn't convinced whether the old man was innocent or not. Just because no evidence could be found did not mean anything. Old man Pritched could have disposed of all the evidence. Either way, Todd was reconvinced it was none of his business. He decided at that moment to leave it to the police to resolve such matters. For the remainder of the walk, he shifted his thoughts to devising a lie to tell his parents about why he'd been gone so long.